You found this place. I am not certain how. I am not certain it matters. What matters is that you are here, and the door is open, and something in you, something older than reason, already knows you should not have come in. Welcome to the vault. I am the warden. This is the first transmission. There will be others, if you return. Not everything held in this place is safe to release. Not everything sealed away deserves to remain sealed. I decide which is which. That has always been my purpose. Tonight, I have made my first decision. Tonight I have unlocked something that has rested in the dark for over a century. The Rats in the Walls by Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Published in 1924. You will understand, when it is finished, why a man might restore a cursed ancestral home and call it reclamation, and why the walls themselves might disagree. There is a particular kind of horror that lives not in what arrives from outside, but in what was always waiting beneath you. Lovecraft understood this. The horror of inheritance, the horror of blood, the horror of discovering that the darkness in your family tree has roots that go down far deeper than any genealogy can reach. If you have not yet subscribed to the Vault, I invite you to do so now. The door will be open when you return. It is always open. Imagine an English countryside, a crumbling priory perched on a limestone cliff overlooking a desolate valley. The cold smell of centuries, moss and mold, and the silence of a place that the local people have hated, quietly, persistently, without ever quite being able to say why. Something is below the stones. Something has always been below the stones. Begin. On July 16, 1923, I moved into Exham Priory after the last workman had finished his labors. The restoration had been a stupendous task, for little had remained of the deserted pile but a shell-like ruin. Yet because it had been the seat of my ancestors, I let no expense deter me. Size. The place had not been inhabited since the reign of James I, when a tragedy of intensely hideous, though largely unexplained nature had struck down the master, 5 of his children, and several servants. And driven forth under a cloud of suspicion and terror, the 3rd son, my lineal progenitor, and the only survivor of the abhorred line. Whispers. With this sole heir denounced as a murderer, the estate had reverted to the crown, nor had the accused man made any attempt to exculpate himself or regain his property. Shaken by some horror greater than that of conscience or the law, and expressing only a frantic wish to exclude the ancient edifice from his sight and memory, Walter Delapore, 11th Baron Exham, fled to Virginia, and there founded the family which by the next century had become known as Delapore. Exham Priory had remained untenanted, though later allotted to the estates of the Norris family, and much studied because of its peculiarly composite architecture. An architecture involving Gothic towers resting on a Saxon or Romanesque substructure, whose foundation in turn was of a still earlier order or blend of orders, Roman, and even Druidic or native Cymric, if legends speak truly. Curious. This foundation was a very singular thing, being merged on one side with the solid limestone of the precipice from whose brink the priory overlooked a desolate valley 3 miles west of the village of Anchester. Architects and antiquarians loved to examine this strange relic of forgotten centuries, but the country folk hated it. Size. They had hated it hundreds of years before, when my ancestors lived there, and they hated it now, with the moss and mold of abandonment on it. I had not been a day in Anchester before I knew I came of an accursed house. And this week workmen have blown up Exham Priory and are busy obliterating the traces of its foundations. The bare statistics of my ancestry I had always known, together with the fact that my first American forebear had come to the colonies under a strange cloud. Curious. Of details, however, I had been kept wholly ignorant through the policy of reticence always maintained by the Delapores. Unlike our planter neighbors, we seldom boasted of crusading ancestors or other medieval and Renaissance heroes, nor was any kind of tradition handed down except what may have been recorded in the sealed envelope left before the Civil War by every squire to his eldest son for posthumous opening. Thoughtful. The glories we cherished were those achieved since the migration, the glories of a proud and honorable, if somewhat reserved and unsocial, Virginia line. During the war, our fortunes were extinguished and our whole existence changed by the burning of Carfax, our home on the banks of the James. My grandfather, advanced in years, had perished in that incendiary outrage, and with him the envelope that bound us all to the past. Nostalgic. I can recall that fire today as I saw it then at the age of 7, with the Federal soldiers shouting, the women screaming, and the Negroes howling and praying. My father was in the army, defending Richmond, and after many formalities, my mother and I were passed through the lines to join him. When the war ended, we all moved north, whence my mother had come, and I grew to manhood, middle age, and ultimate wealth as a stolid Yankee. Reflective. Neither my father nor I ever knew what our hereditary envelope had contained, and as I merged into the grayness of Massachusetts business life, I lost all interest in the mysteries which evidently lurked far back in my family tree. Had I suspected their nature, how gladly I would have left Exham Priory to its moss, bats, and cobwebs. My father died in 1904, but without any message to leave me or to my only child, Alfred, a motherless boy of 10. Sighs. It was this boy who reversed the order of family information, for although I could give him only jesting conjectures about the past, he wrote me of some very interesting ancestral legends when the late war took him to England in 1917 as an aviation officer. Apparently the Delapores had a colorful and perhaps sinister history, for a friend of my son's, Captain Mo, Edward Norris of the Royal Flying Corps, dwelt near the family seat at Anchester and related some peasant superstitions which few novelists could equal for wildness and incredibility. Curious, it was this legendary which definitely turned my attention to my transatlantic heritage and made me resolve to purchase and restore the family seat. I bought Exham Priory in 1918, but was almost immediately distracted from my plans of restoration by the return of my son as a maimed invalid. During the 2 years that he lived, I thought of nothing but his care. In 1921, as I found myself bereaved and aimless, Sighs, a retired manufacturer no longer young, I resolved to divert my remaining years with my new possession. Visiting Anchester in December, I was entertained by Captain Norris, a plump, amiable young man who had thought much of my son and secured his assistance in gathering plans and anecdotes to guide in the coming restoration. Exham Priory itself I saw without emotion, curious, a jumble of tottering medieval ruins covered with lichens and honeycombed with rooks' nests perched perilously upon a precipice, and denuded of floors or other interior features save the stone walls of the separate towers. As I gradually recovered the image of the edifice as it had been when my ancestor left it over 3 centuries before, I began to hire workmen for the reconstruction. In every case, I was forced to go outside the immediate locality, for the Anchester villagers had an almost unbelievable fear and hatred of the place. Sighs. My son had told me that he was somewhat avoided during his visits because he was a Delapore, and I now found myself subtly ostracized for a like reason. What the people could not forgive, perhaps, was that I had come to restore a symbol so abhorrent to them, for, rationally or not, they viewed Exham Priory as nothing less than a haunt of fiends and werewolves. Piecing together the tales which Norris collected for me, and supplementing them with the accounts of several savants who had studied the ruins, I deduced that Exham Priory stood on the site of a prehistoric temple, a druidical or anti-druidical thing which must have been contemporary with Stonehenge. Curious, that indescribable rites had been celebrated there, few doubted, and there were unpleasant tales of the transference of these rites into the Sibyl worship which the Romans had introduced. Inscriptions still visible in the subcellar bore such unmistakable letters as Div, OPS, Magna, Mat, sign of the Magna Mater whose dark worship was once vainly forbidden to Roman citizens. Size, about 1000 AD. The place is mentioned in a chronicle as being a substantial stone priory housing a strange and powerful monastic order and surrounded by extensive gardens which needed no walls to exclude a frightened populace. Of my family before the grant to Gilbert de Delapore there is no evil report, but something strange must have happened then. In one chronicle there is a reference to a Delapore as cursed of God in 1307, whilst village legendary had nothing but evil and frantic fear to tell of the castle that went up on the foundations of the old temple and priory. Whispers. The fireside tales were of the most grisly description, all the ghastlier because of their frightened reticence and cloudy evasiveness. They represented my ancestors as a race of hereditary demons beside whom Gilles de Retz and the Marquis de Sade would seem the veriest tyros, and hinted whisperingly at their responsibility for the occasional disappearance of villagers through several generations. There seemed to be an inner cult in the family, presided over by the head of the house, and sometimes closed except to a few members. Curious temperament rather than ancestry was evidently the basis of this cult, for it was entered by several who married into the family. Lady Margaret Trevor from Cornwall became a favorite bane of children all over the countryside, and the demon heroine of a particularly horrible old ballad not yet extinct near the Welsh border. And most vivid of all the local lore was the dramatic epic of the rats, the scampering army of obscene vermin which had burst forth from the castle 3 months after the tragedy that doomed it to desertion, the lean, filthy, ravenous army which had swept all before it and devoured fowl, cats, dogs, hogs, sheep, and even 2 hapless human beings before its fury was spent. Such was the lore that assailed me as I pushed to completion, with an elderly obstinacy, the work of restoring my ancestral home. When the task was done over 2 years after its commencement, I viewed the great rooms, wainscoted walls, vaulted ceilings, mullioned windows, and broad staircases with a pride which fully compensated for the prodigious expense of the restoration. Sighs. The seat of my fathers was complete, and I looked forward to redeeming at last the local fame of the line which ended in me. I would reside here permanently and prove that a Delapore need not be a fiend. My comfort was perhaps augmented by the fact that, although Exham Priory was medievally fitted, its interior was in truth wholly new and free from old vermin and old ghosts alike. As I have said, I moved in on July 16, 1923. My household consisted of 7 servants and 9 cats, of which latter species I am particularly fond. My eldest cat, Niggerman, was 7 years old and had come with me from my home in Bolton, Massachusetts. For 5 days our routine proceeded with the utmost placidity, my time being spent mostly in the codification of old family data. Curious, I had now obtained some very circumstantial accounts of the final tragedy and flight of Walter de la Poer. It appeared that my ancestor was accused with much reason of having killed all the other members of his household, except 4 servant confederates in their sleep, about 2 weeks after a shocking discovery which changed his whole demeanor, but which, except by implication, he disclosed to no one, save perhaps the servants who afterward fled beyond reach. This deliberate slaughter, which included a father, 3 brothers, and 2 sisters, was largely condoned by the villagers, and so slackly treated by the law that its perpetrator escaped honored, unharmed, and undisguised to Virginia. The general whispered sentiment being that he had purged the land of an immemorial curse. Curious. What discovery had prompted an act so terrible, I could scarcely even conjecture. Walter de la Poer must have known for years the sinister tales about his family, so that this material could have given him no fresh impulse. Had he then witnessed some appalling ancient rite, or stumbled upon some frightful and revealing symbol in the priory or its vicinity? Sighs. He was reputed to have been a shy, gentle youth in England. In Virginia, he seemed not so much hard or bitter as harassed and apprehensive. On July 22nd occurred the first incident, which, though lightly dismissed at the time, takes on a preternatural significance in relation to later events. Curious, what I afterward remembered is merely this, that my old black cat, whose moods I know so well, was undoubtedly alert and anxious to an extent wholly out of keeping with his natural character. He roved from room to room, restless and disturbed, and sniffed constantly about the walls which formed part of the old Gothic structure. Sighs. I realize how trite this sounds, like the inevitable dog in the ghost story, which always growls before his master sees the sheeted figure, yet I cannot consistently suppress it. The following day, a servant complained of restlessness among all the cats in the house. He came to me in my study, a lofty west room on the second story, with groined arches, black oak paneling, and a triple Gothic window overlooking the limestone cliff and desolate valley. And even as he spoke, I saw the jetty form of Nigger Man creeping along the west wall and scratching at the new panels which overlaid the ancient stone. Curious, I told the man that there must be some singular odor or emanation from the old stonework, imperceptible to human senses, but affecting the delicate organs of cats even through the new woodwork. Sighs. When the fellow suggested the presence of mice or rats, I mentioned that there had been no rats there for 300 years. That night, dispensing as usual with a valet, I retired in the west tower chamber which I had chosen as my own. This room was circular, very high, and without wainscoting, being hung with arras, which I had myself chosen in London. Sighs. Seeing that Nigger Man was with me, I shut the heavy Gothic door and retired by the light of electric bulbs which so cleverly counterfeited candles, finally switching off the light and sinking on the carved and canopied four-poster, with the venerable cat in his accustomed place across my feet. There was a suspicion of aurora in the sky, and the delicate traceries of the window were pleasantly silhouetted. At some time I must have fallen quietly asleep, for I recall a distinct sense of leaving strange dreams when the cat started violently from his placid position. Curious. He was looking intensely at a point on the wall somewhat west of the window, a point which to my eye had nothing to mark it, and as I watched, I knew that Nigger Man was not vainly excited. Whether the arras actually moved, I cannot say. I think it did, very slightly. But what I can swear to is that behind it I heard a low, distinct scurrying as of rats or mice. Surprised. In a moment the cat had jumped bodily on the screening tapestry, bringing the affected section to the floor with his weight and exposing a damp, ancient wall of stone, patched here and there by the restorers, and devoid of any trace of rodent prowlers. In the morning I questioned all the servants and found that none of them had noticed anything unusual. Curious, I drowsed away the noontime, and in the afternoon called again on Captain Norris, who became exceedingly interested in what I told him. We were genuinely perplexed at the presence of rats, and Norris lent me some traps and Paris green, which I had the servants place in strategic localities when I returned. I retired early, being very sleepy, but was harassed by dreams of the most horrible sort. Uneasy. I seemed to be looking down from an immense height upon a twilit grotto, knee-deep with filth, where a white-bearded demon swineherd drove about with his staff a flock of fungus, flabby beasts whose appearance filled me with unutterable loathing. Then, as the swineherd paused and nodded over his task, gasps, a mighty swarm of rats rained down on the stinking abyss and fell to devouring beasts and man alike. From this terrific vision, I was abruptly awaked by the motions of Nigger Man, who had been sleeping as usual across my feet. Surprised, for on every side of the chamber the walls were alive with nauseous sound, the verminous slithering of ravenous, gigantic rats. As the bulbs leapt into radiance, I saw a hideous shaking all over the tapestry, causing the somewhat peculiar designs to execute a singular dance of death. Pause. This motion disappeared almost at once, and the sound with it. When I examined the circular trap that had been placed in the room, I found all of the openings sprung, though no trace remained of what had been caught and had escaped. Further sleep was out of the question, so lighting a candle, I opened the door and went out in the gallery toward the stairs to my study. Before we had reached the stone steps, the cat darted ahead of me and vanished down the ancient flight. Curious, as I descended the stairs myself, I became suddenly aware of sounds in the great room below. The oak-paneled walls were alive with rats, scampering and milling, whilst Niggerman was racing about with the fury of a baffled hunter. Surprised, these creatures, in numbers apparently inexhaustible, were engaged in one stupendous migration from inconceivable heights to some depth conceivably or inconceivably below. I now heard steps in the corridor, and in another moment 2 servants pushed open the massive door. Curious, they were searching the house for some unknown source of disturbance which had thrown all the cats into a snarling panic and caused them to plunge precipitately down several flights of stairs and squat, yowling, before the closed door to the subcellar. I asked them if they had heard the rats, but they replied in the negative. And when I turned to call their attention to the sounds in the panels, I realized that the noise had ceased. Sighs. All were sprung, yet all were tenantless. Satisfying myself that no one had heard the rats save the felines and me, I sat in my study till morning, thinking profoundly and recalling every scrap of legend I had unearthed concerning the building I inhabited. Later, I telephoned to Captain Norris, who came over and helped me explore the subcellar. Absolutely nothing untoward was found, although we could not repress a thrill at the knowledge that this vault was built by Roman hands. Curious, every low arch and massive pillar was Roman, not the debased Romanesque of the bungling Saxons, but the severe and harmonious classicism of the age of the Caesars. The reference to Attis made me shiver, for I had read Catullus and knew something of the hideous rites of the Eastern god, whose worship was so mixed with that of Cybele. Sighs. On one of the stone altar blocks were some brown stains which made me wonder. The largest, in the center of the room, had certain features on the upper surface which indicated its connection with fire, probably burnt offerings. Such were the sights in that crypt before whose door the cats had howled and where Norris and I now determined to pass the night. We decided to keep the great oak door tightly closed, and, with this attended to, we retired with lanterns still burning to await whatever might occur. The vault was very deep in the foundations of the priory, and undoubtedly far down on the face of the beetling limestone cliff overlooking the waste valley. As we lay there expectantly, I found my vigil occasionally mixed with half-formed dreams from which the uneasy motions of the cat across my feet would rouse me. Uneasy. I saw again the twilit grotto, and the swineherd with his unmentionable fungus beasts wallowing in filth. Then I did observe the flabby features of one of them, and awaked with such a scream that Niggerman started up, whilst Captain Norris, who had not slept, Chuckles laughed considerably. Norris waked me when the phenomena began. Out of the same frightful dream I was called by his gentle shaking and his urging to listen to the cats. Curious. Indeed, there was much to listen to, for beyond the closed door at the head of the stone steps was a veritable nightmare of feline yelling and clawing, whilst Niggerman was running excitedly around the bare stone walls, in which I heard the same babel of scurrying rats that had troubled me the night before. An acute terror now rose within me, for here were anomalies which nothing normal could well explain. Sighs. These rats, if not the creatures of a madness which I shared with the cats alone, must be burrowing and sliding in Roman walls I had thought to be of solid limestone blocks. But even so, the spectral horror was no less, for if these were living vermin, why did not Norris hear their disgusting commotion? By the time I had managed to tell him what I thought I was hearing, my ears gave me the last fading impression of the scurrying, which had retreated still downward, far underneath this deepest of subcellars, till it seemed as if the whole cliff below were riddled with questing rats. Curious. Norris was not as skeptical as I had anticipated. He motioned to me to notice that the cats at the door had ceased their clamor, as if giving up the rats for lost. whilst Niggerman had a burst of renewed restlessness and was clawing frantically around the bottom of the large stone altar in the center of the room. Norris now took a lantern close to the altar and examined the place where Niggerman was pawing, silently kneeling and scraping away the lichens of centuries which joined the massive pre-Roman block to the tessellated floor. Curious. He was about to abandon his effort when I noticed a trivial circumstance which made me shudder. It was only this, that the flame of the lantern set down near the altar was slightly but certainly flickering from a draft of air which came indubitably from the crevice between floor and altar where Norris was scraping away the lichens. We spent the rest of the night in the brilliantly lighted study, nervously discussing what we should do next. Sighs. The discovery that some vault deeper than the deepest known masonry of the Romans underlay this accursed pile, some vault unsuspected by the curious antiquarians of 3 centuries, would have been sufficient to excite us without any background of the sinister. By morning we had compromised and decided to go to London to gather a group of archaeologists and scientific men fit to cope with the mystery. Curious, we had vainly tried to move the central altar, which we now recognized as the gate to a new pit of nameless fear. What secret would open the gate? Wiser men than we would have to find. During many days in London, Captain Norris and I presented our facts, conjectures, and legendary anecdotes to 5 eminent authorities, all men who could be trusted. On the evening of August 7th, we reached Exham Priory, where the servants assured me that nothing unusual had occurred. The cats had been perfectly placid, and not a trap in the house had been sprung. Sighs. Sleep came quickly that night, but hideous dreams assailed me. There was a vision of a Roman feast like that of Trimalchio, with a horror in a covered platter. Shudders. Then came that damnable recurrent thing about the swineherd and his filthy drove in the twilit grotto. All was now ready, and at 11 a.m., our entire group of 7 men, bearing powerful electric searchlights and implements of excavation, went down to the subcellar and bolted the door behind us. Prime attention was paid to the momentous central altar, and within an hour, Sir William Brinton had caused it to tilt backward, balanced by some unknown species of counterweight. There now lay revealed such a horror as would have overwhelmed us had we not been prepared. Through a nearly square opening in the tiled floor, sprawling on a flight of stone steps so prodigiously worn that it was little more than an inclined plane at the center, was a ghastly array of human or semi-human bones. Those which retained their collocation as skeletons showed attitudes of panic fear, and overall were the marks of rodent gnawing. The skulls denoted nothing short of utter idiocy, cretinism, or primitive semi-apedom. Above the hellishly littered steps arched a descending passage, seemingly chiseled from the solid rock. It was then that Sir William, examining the hewn walls, made the odd observation that the passage, according to the direction of the strokes, must have been chiseled from beneath. After plowing down a few steps amidst the gnawed bones, we saw that there was light ahead. Not any mystic phosphorescence, but a filtered daylight, which could not come except from unknown fissures in the cliff that overlooked the waste valley. A few steps more, and our breaths were literally snatched from us by what we saw. So literally that Thornton, the psychic investigator, actually fainted in the arms of the dazed man who stood behind him. Norris, his plump face utterly white and flabby, simply cried out inarticulately, whilst I think that what I did was to gasp or hiss and cover my eyes. Of 7 cultivated men, only Sir William Brinton retained his composure, a thing more to his credit because he led the party and must have seen the sight first. It was a twilit grotto of enormous height, stretching away farther than any eye could see. A subterraneous world of limitless mystery and horrible suggestion. There were buildings and other architectural remains. In one terrified glance, I saw a weird pattern of tumuli, a savage circle of monoliths, a low-domed Roman ruin, a sprawling Saxon pile, and an early English edifice of wood. But all these were dwarfed by the ghoulish spectacle presented by the general surface of the ground. For yards about the steps extended an insane tangle of human bones, or bones at least as human as those on the steps. Like a foamy sea they stretched, some fallen apart, but others wholly or partly articulated as skeletons. These latter invariably in postures of demonic frenzy, either fighting off some menace or clutching other forms with cannibal intent. When Dr. Trask, the anthropologist, stooped to classify the skulls, he found a degraded mixture which utterly baffled him. They were mostly lower than the Piltdown man in the scale of evolution, but in every case, definitely human. All the bones were gnawed, mostly by rats, but somewhat by others of the half-human drove. It was the antechamber of hell, and poor Thornton fainted again when Trask told him that some of the skeleton things must have descended as quadrupeds through the last 20 or more generations. Horror, horror, as we began to interpret the architectural remains. The quadruped things had been kept in stone pens, out of which they must have broken in their last delirium of hunger or rat fear. There had been great herds of them, evidently fattened on the coarse vegetables whose remains could be found as a sort of poisonous ensilage at the bottom of huge stone bins older than Rome. I knew now why my ancestors had had such excessive gardens. Would to heaven I could forget. Sir William, standing with his searchlight in the Roman ruin, translated aloud the most shocking ritual I have ever known, and told of the diet of the antediluvian cult which the priests of Cybele found and mingled with their own. Having grasped to some slight degree the frightful revelations of this twilit area, we turned to that apparently boundless depth of midnight cavern where no ray of light from the cliff could penetrate. We shall never know what sightless Stygian worlds yawn beyond the little distance we went, for it was decided that such secrets are not good for mankind. But there was plenty to engross us close at hand, for we had not gone far before the searchlight showed that accursed infinity of pits in which the rats had feasted, and whose sudden lack of replenishment had driven the ravenous rodent army first to turn on the living herds of starving things, and then to burst forth from the priory in that historic orgy of devastation which the peasants will never forget. God, those carrion black pits of sawed, picked bones and opened skulls. Those nightmare chasms choked with the pithecanthropoid, Celtic, Roman, and English bones of countless unhallowed centuries. Some of them were full, and none can say how deep they had once been. Others were still bottomless to our searchlights. Once my foot slipped near a horribly yawning brink, and I had a moment of ecstatic fear. Then there came a sound from that inky, boundless, farther distance that I thought I knew, and I saw my old black cat dart past me like a winged Egyptian god, straight into the illimitable gulf of the unknown. It was the eldritch scurrying of those fiend-born rats, always questing for new horrors, and determined to lead me on even unto those grinning caverns of Earth's center where Nyarlathotep, the mad, faceless god, howls blindly to the piping of two amorphous, idiot flute players. My searchlight expired, but still I ran. I heard voices and yowls and echoes, but above all there gently rose that impious, insidious scurrying, gently rising, rising, as a stiff, bloated corpse gently rises above an oily river that flows under endless onyx bridges to a black, putrid sea. Something bumped into me, something soft and plump. It must have been the rats, the viscous, gelatinous, ravenous army that feast on the dead and the living. Why shouldn't rats eat a Delapore as a Delapore eats forbidden things? The war ate my boy, damn them all. And the Yanks ate Carfax with flames and burnt grandsire Delapore and the secret. No, No, I tell you, I am not that demon swineherd in the twilit grotto. Magna Mater, 80s, dia ad agi sad oden, agus bas dunach ort, donus stolas ort, agus litza, ungul, ruch, ch. That is what they say, I said, when they found me in the blackness after 3 hours. Found me crouching in the blackness over the plump, half-eaten body of Captain Norries, with my own cat leaping and tearing at my throat. Now they have blown up Exham Priory, taken my nigger man away from me, and shut me into this barred room at Hanwell, with fearful whispers about my heredity and experiences. Thornton is in the next room, but they prevent me from talking to him. They are trying, too, to suppress most of the facts concerning the Priory. When I speak of poor Norries, they accuse me of a hideous thing, but they must know that I did not do it. They must know it was the rats, the slithering, scurrying rats whose scampering will never let me sleep. The demon rats that race behind the padding in this room and beckon me down to greater horrors than I have ever known. The rats they can never hear. The rats in the walls. The door is closed. For now. What Delapore found beneath Exham Priory was not a monster that arrived in the night. It was himself. It was always himself. If you wish to return, and I suspect you do, subscribe to the Vault. The next transmission has already been selected. You will want to be here when I unlock it. Until then, stay in the dark.